All right, so let's start with the exchange variation, and then we'll talk more about the knight f3, knight c3 lines. Exchange variation 3, c takes d5, followed by c takes d5. One of the great tragedies of the Slav exchange variation is that its reputation has been soiled in the past by the fact that it has been the most popular line for prearranged draws in tournament games. Countless games have been, quote, played along the lines of, let's see, 4, knight c3, knight c6, knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4, bishop f5, e3, e6, bishop d3, bishop takes, queen takes, bishop d6, bishop takes, queen takes, castle, and castle, followed by a random number of uninteresting moves and a draw before move 20. Oh my goodness. So that was just at the end of move 11. So what do we have here? It looks like the engine is saying, yeah, rook on A to C1. And then black would be a rook on F to C8, A3, knight to A5, rook C2. Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if this position, if we played against an engine, would it be a draw? Rook A C8. Was it knight C5, rook C7, A3, rook on F to C8, B4, and H6. Interesting. Okay. And yet the exchange on D5 is a perfectly legitimate and highly serious way of playing. A strategy that's been successfully employed by great champions like Botvinnik, Portish, and Kasparov. It is based on the assumption that it is precisely in a symmetrical position that the advantage of having the first move can be most dangerous. All right, so let's see. Knight c3. And then knight f6. A somewhat puzzling feature of the exchange Slav is that its theory does not really start before the position shown in the diagram after white's sixth move below. In what way this position is best reached, however, is a sadly neglected question. So much is certain that knight f6, 4 knight f6, is played far more often than 4 knight c6, with some aggressive ideas like bishop f4 and then e5. Yet the only move that could possibly prove the latter wrong, or at least inaccurate, is 5 e4. And almost nothing is known about this. Since 5d takes e4 and d5 looks rather dangerous, knight f6 seems like a sensible reply. This produces a position from the pawn of attack of the Karo Khan. If white continues, e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight f3. So this would be the pawn of attack of the Karo Khan. However, if e5, 6e5, followed by knight e4, bishop d3, for instance, leads us into totally unknown territory. We should also note that 4e5 transposes to a line of the Winnower counter gambit, and so totally changes the strategic picture. White can, of course, avoid this possibility by playing 4 knight f3, or by inserting on the third move, knight f3, knight f6, before exchanging pawns on d5. We now return to knight f6. Knight f3. At this point, theory begins to be interested, if only vaguely. So 5 knight f3 and 5 bishop f4 are about equally popular, with the latter move being considered slightly more flexible. Still, after 5 bishop f4, knight c6, e3, the general picture is almost the same, as after knight f3, knight c6, bishop f4, and then same thing, bishop f5, and then black's going to, or e6, are the traditional moves, and a6, the cheeky newcomer. Five, knight c6, bishop f4. This is the most important point of the departure for the Slav exchange variation. Black now has 4 moves, all giving the game a decided flavor of its own. Bishop f5 is the most traditional option, preserving the symmetry and challenging white to show what his, quote, advantage is worth. For this purpose, e3, e6, bishop b5 is the preferred choice. White is threatening knight to e5 and is hoping to at least to saddle his opponent with a backward c-pawn after a future bishop takes c6 and b takes c6. Black has to concede some ground here, and the 8th move, knight to d7, is generally looked upon as the best defense. The main line then runs queen a4, rook c8, castle kingside, a6, bishop takes c6, rook takes c6, rook on f to c1. When white has a tiny lead in development, however, it is very difficult to turn this into a more tangible advantage. Interesting that the engine gives it a little bit favorable for black with a negative 0.24. With what, f6, 92, bishop b6, queen d1. Okay. Another long-standing main line is 5, e6. So instead of putting the bishop out to f5, which is usually looked upon as perhaps a little bit on the passive side, but very reliable. After e3, and then bishop d6. It does note that bishop e7 is also a good move. White can simply take on d6, or he can keep a little more tension in the position by playing bishop to g3. This aims to make castling kingside less attractive for black. For example, if black castles kingside, bishop d3, followed by knight to e5, could be troublesome. A solid alternative is bishop takes g3, h takes g3, queen to d6, delaying castling and stopping white from playing knight to e5. Indeed, black could now take the initiative in the center himself by playing e5 at some point. A far more recent origin is the attempt to preempt any possible aggression by white on the queen side by playing a6. This has an added advantage in that it retains the possibility of bishop g4, which would now be an excellent reply if white were to continue e3. The immediate bishop g4 has a bad reputation because of 7 knight to e5. But if white does not have this reply, as after a6, e3, bishop g4, this active development of the queen's bishop is perfectly playable. In fact, this is why many players meet a6 with 7 rook to c1 instead of e3. Only if black then, quote, commits himself with bishop f5 is a3 ventured. In practice, however, black has experienced few difficulties in this line. Having a pawn on a6 has turned out to be simply quite useful. This a6 variation is especially important since those who play a6 in the standard Slav lines are committed to this line if white exchanges on d5. In a line like knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, a6, c takes d5, c takes d5. Equally youthful and perhaps even more amazing is the bold sally 6 knight to e4. Black breaks the symmetry and intends to continue e3, knight c3, b takes c3, g6. This variation contains an element of risk, but at least white must now really fight for the initiative, and it therefore seems a very suitable choice against an opponent who had been looking forward to an easy draw.